Hi everyone, in today's video we are going to continue with our topics related to Islamic theology. We've been talking about the evolution of formal theology in Islam, and we have spoken about the different schools of thought. We have spoken about the Kalam and those, or in this case Islamic theology, and those who engage in theological analysis, studies and dispute, those who are called mutakallimun. We have spoken regarding the two great schools, very important schools, the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ariyya. And today we are going to mention briefly about the Islamic philosophy, because to understand the great debates of the great theologians in Islam, we have to be conscious that many of them were also engaged in philosophy. Therefore, the philosophers, the pure philosophers and the theologians were working together sometimes to reconcile the revelation with the rational thinking of the philosophy. And both of them could be actually referred as mutakallimun. Regarding the philosophy within the Islamic world, it is clear that when Islam expanded and new territories were conquered, we found that under the dominion of Islam, great libraries with many thousands of books came under the control of the great thinkers of Islam. Therefore, in a short period of time, they were engaged in the translation of these texts into Arabic. And also, great scholars also came under the jurisdiction of the Islamic Empire, and therefore they shared their knowledge with the Arabs, with the Muslims at these specific times when the Islamic Empire expanded. And we have that the great classical texts of the Greek philosophers such as Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, and the thinking of the Stoics and others, some were translated into Arabic, as I mentioned, and the Arabs then starting to apply and to comment, to add their own rational thinking to this kind of philosophical knowledge from the Greeks. And at this time, we find many, not only Muslims, but also Christians and Jews that together with Muslim philosophers were engaged in this process of translating texts and studying these texts and trying to apply the philosophical Greek thought into religion. They were trying to harmonize the revelation of God, the Quran, with the rational philosophical thinking of the great Greek thinkers. By this time, we also have that there is a clear distinction between the pure philosophers and those theologians, the mutakallimun. Why? Because some great scholars used to argue that there must be a difference, a clear line of separation to the extent to which the philosopher can reach or go. And from there on, he cannot go, okay? He cannot trespass these boundaries. And for the philosopher, the pure philosopher claims that the truth must be accepted from whatever source it comes, and you have to follow the argument wherever it takes you. Now the theologian, even though applies philosophical thinking, the theologian says, no, you cannot go beyond certain boundaries. You cannot follow the argument that will go against the revelation of God, in this case the Quran. And therefore, certain ideas that could go against the accepted tradition and understanding of the text of the Quran, you cannot go beyond that with your philosophical thinking. And it was the kind of dispute that arose between the pure philosophers and the theologians who also use philosophical thinking applied to religion. Therefore, many scholars then started to argue that you cannot be a philosopher and a theologian at the same time. And there were other scholars who claim, oh, you can be a philosopher and you can be a theologian at the same time, because there is no contradiction between religion, between divine revelation and between philosophy. And therefore, you can be both together at the same time. You could be a believer, but also you can apply rational philosophical thinking in your life in every situation. Therefore, we have to understand that both the pure philosophers and the theologians, who were also philosophers, engage at the same time in trying to answer some of the most important questions that a human being, not only a believer, a human being in general, could ask himself. And some of these questions are as follows. I will mention briefly some of them, of some of the questions that human beings have asked themselves throughout history, in all different religions, in Islam, Judaism, Christianity, all over the world. For example, and these were the main topics of debates of the philosophers and the theologians, the mutakallimun. For example, what is the nature of God? How do we know that God exists? Just because someone says so? We have to find the answer for this. Rationally, you have to be convinced. You cannot believe things simply because someone tells you to believe it. You have to make sure by yourself about what you believe. What is the system that you believe? What is the religion that you follow? And in a rational way, you have to find answers to some of the big and most important questions that a human being could ask himself. Second, what is the nature of the revelation? And how do we know that God reveals His will to humankind? What is the nature of the divinely guided messengers in relation to philosophers? What is the nature of human leadership on earth? What is our individual religious traditions, or which of our individual religious traditions must be interpreted literally? Or, another question, which of our individual religious traditions must be interpreted allegorically or metaphorically? Do we interpret the Quran literally all the time, or sometimes it's an allegory or a metaphoric way, or any other scripture in general? So how do we know when to apply literal knowledge, interpretation, or is simply an allegory in this case? Also, how can we reconcile the findings of philosophy and science with religion? These are simply some basic questions. Of course, there are many thousands of questions that human beings could ask themselves, the believers in this case, but we can see from these topics that the philosophers and the theologians, who were also philosophers, engage in this kind of thought, trying to find answers to reconcile religion with science, with philosophy. And like I said, in many cases, some claim that there was no issue, others claim there was an issue with philosophy. And among the great Muslim thinkers, not only Arabs, I'm talking in Muslims in general, because there were many great philosophers, Persian philosophers and Greek philosophers who were Muslims also, and many philosophers all over the Islamic empire. Some of the great names that we mention regarding philosophy, among them are Abu Yusuf al-Kindi, Abu Nasr al-Muhammad al-Farabi, also Abu Ali al-Hussein ibn Sina. Another great philosopher that we must mention was Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Rushd, Averroes, how he was known in the West, the great Andalusian, from Al-Andalus today, Spain, from Cordoba, the great philosopher. Some people claim that Ibn Rushd, Averroes, he was the last great philosopher of Islam. And in similar way, as I mentioned before, not only Islamic philosophy was, let's say, active within the Muslim world, but also the Islamic philosophical thought influenced the Jewish and the Christians thinkers. And we find that at the same time, philosophers from the three monotheistic religions that were engaged in these topics. And among the great, for example, Jewish theologians, we could mention Sa'id ibn Yusuf al-Fayumi, Abu Imran ibn Maimonides, the great philosopher, among many others. Therefore, we can notice that there was an exchange of philosophy, an exchange of science, an exchange of poetry, art, knowledge throughout the Islamic empire, and those who lived under the Islamic empire, either Jewish, Christians, and many others, simply share and learn and share all this knowledge and borrow material and let's say understanding from each other. And it is very interesting that philosophy, this kind of philosophical thought that looks like that was kind of against the rebel tradition of Islam, this kind of philosophy was not accepted or had not that big impact within the Muslim world. But was this kind of philosophy the one that had a big impact in Europe, because it was thanks to the translation of the Greek text into Arabic and the commentaries of the great Arab philosophers that this kind of knowledge got into the universities in Europe. And we have that because of this kind of knowledge was preserved, and was a development of philosophy also a great influence in the European universities thanks to the philosophers of Islam. But we find that in general, the books of the philosophers in Islam that had a big influence are the books those that deal with theology, those that deal with theological thought applied to religion. And among the great thinkers of Islamic philosophy in religious terms, theology, we could mention the great Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali, there is no question, they call him the proof of Islam because of his deep knowledge of the religion, of the philosophy, and the religions of the monotheics, let's say Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and many others. And he explained and prove in a clear, logical way in this case the last revelation of the Quran and the great thinking of the Islamic understanding, the knowledge that was revealed to the world, in this case through the Quran. So in the next video we are going to continue with these similar topics connected with Islamic thought. We will talk about more in details regarding the history of Islam and regarding history of the great monotheistic religions in general. Thank you so much for your attention, and we'll see each other in the next video.